The Hall of Voices was the largest room that any human being had ever stepped inside, and even after 11 standard cycles of attending sessions there, Ambassador Lyra Osei still felt small whenever she walked through its towering crystal doors. The chamber stretched in every direction like a cathedral carved from living glass, with seats rising in great tiers that held representatives from over 40 alien species, each one older and more powerful than the last. And at the very center of it all sat the High Arbiter Seunuvai, an ancient insectoid creature whose compound eyes had witnessed the rise and fall of entire civilizations before humanity had even learned to make fire. Today was supposed to be a good day. Today was the day the Council would hear humanity's formal petition for full membership, a status that would give Earth independent military patrol rights in its own sector, and a permanent voice in the halls of galactic power. And Lyra had spent 3 years preparing for this moment, building alliances, trading favors, and carefully proving that humans deserved a seat at the table with the elder races. She stood at the center of the human delegation and adjusted the collar of her formal uniform, then glanced to her right, where Master Chief Petty Officer Elias Harrow stood like a statue carved from stone. Elias was humanity's military attaché to the Council, a position that most species treated as ceremonial, but there was nothing ceremonial about the man who filled it. He was 6 feet 2 inches of dense muscle and quiet discipline, with close-cropped hair and pale gray eyes that never seemed to blink at the right times. And he wore his dress uniform the way a wolf might wear a collar, with the unspoken understanding that he could remove it whenever he chose. He had not spoken a single word since they entered the chamber, and Lyra preferred it that way, because Elias was not the kind of man whose silence was empty. It was the kind of silence that made people nervous for reasons they could never quite explain. Pin. The session began with the usual formalities, and the High Arbiter called the matter of human membership to the floor, and for a brief shining moment, Lyra allowed herself to believe that this would go smoothly. Then Counselor Thalvek Zoran stood up. Thalvek was a Dralith, which meant he was 7 feet tall, with dark green scales that caught the light like polished armor, a long muscular tail that swayed behind him with the lazy confidence of a predator who had never once been prey, and claws on each finger that could cut through steel if he pressed hard enough. He sat on the Security Presidium, and he had made it his personal mission to keep humanity locked out of the Council for as long as he drew breath. "I object to the petition," Thalvek announced, his voice booming through the chamber like a war drum, and a ripple of murmurs spread across the gallery because everyone knew that Thalvek had been waiting for this moment. Lyra kept her face perfectly still as the Dralith counselor walked to the center of the floor, with the kind of theatrical swagger that only someone born into galactic aristocracy could manage. "The humans have been among us for 11 cycles, Thalvek continued, spreading his clawed hands wide as if addressing children, and in that time they have done nothing to demonstrate that they possess the discipline, the temperament, or the basic biological stability required to serve as full members of this council." He tapped a device on his wrist, and the air above the chamber floor erupted with holographic footage. Wars, riots, explosions, cities burning, soldiers screaming, bodies lying in rubble. All of it pulled from Earth's long and bloody history and presented without context or explanation. "This is what they are," Thalvek said, his golden eyes sweeping across the gallery with the satisfaction of a prosecutor presenting his final evidence. "They are a species that has spent its entire existence slaughtering itself, and now they come to us and ask for the right to carry weapons in our space. I say they are not ready. I say they may never be ready." Lyra stepped forward, and the High Arbiter gave her the floor. "Counselor Thalvek presents our history as if it exists in isolation," she said, her voice calm and steady. "But every species in this chamber has a past marked by conflict, and what matters is not where we have been, but where we are going." Humanity has maintained peace among its nations for over 60 years. We have contributed to galactic humanitarian missions. We have honored every treaty we have signed, and we have asked for nothing that we have not earned. It was a good speech, measured and rational, and several delegations nodded in quiet agreement. Thalvek dismissed it with a wave of his clawed hand, as if swatting an insect from the air. Words, he said. Humans are very skilled with words, almost as skilled as they are with weapons. But words do not change biology, and your biology is that of unstable predators who cannot control their own impulses. Then his golden eyes shifted, and for the first time, they locked onto Elias Harrow. And speaking of predators, Thalvek said, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his scaled face, I see you have brought your war creature with you, Ambassador. Tell me, does he perform tricks, or is he simply here for decoration? A cold silence fell across the chamber. Lyra felt heat rise in her chest, but before she could respond, Thalvek had already turned his full attention to Elias, walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps. You, Thalvek said, pointing one clawed finger at Elias, you are what they call a warrior, yes? A Navy SEAL, I believe the term is, one of humanity's finest killers, trained from youth to destroy and nothing more. Elias did not move, and he did not speak. He stood exactly where he had been standing since the session began, his hands clasped behind his back, his gray eyes watching the Draelith approach with the flat calm of a man who had once spent 48 hours lying motionless in a frozen ditch, waiting for a single shot. PP, look at him, Thalvek said to the gallery, gesturing at Elias as though presenting an exhibit in a zoo. This is what humanity offers the galaxy, a decorative pet, a war-bred primitive kept on a leash by handlers who hope he will not embarrass them. This is not a species ready for power. This is a species that should be grateful we allow them in the room at all. Scattered laughter echoed from the Draelith delegation, and a few of their allied species joined in. But most of the chamber remained silent, because there was something about the way the human soldier stood there, perfectly still, perfectly quiet, absorbing every insult without a flicker of reaction, that made the laughter feel thin and uncertain. Lyra opened her mouth to intervene, but the High Arbiter signaled that the session had reached its time limit. And just like that, it was over. The matter was tabled for the following day, and the delegations began to file out of the chamber in a river of scales and fur and chitin. As the human delegation walked back through the crystal corridors, Lyra fell into step beside Elias. I am sorry you had to endure that, she said quietly. Elias looked at her, and for just a moment, something moved behind those gray eyes. Not anger, not hurt, but something older and colder, something that lived in the deep water where light could not reach. He is not finished, Elias said, and it was the first time he had spoken all day. Lyra studied him for a long moment, then nodded. No, she agreed, he is not. Far ahead of them, visible through the corridor's transparent walls, Thalvek stood, surrounded by his entourage, his tail swinging with satisfaction as he spoke in rapid Draelith. And though Lyra could not hear the words, she could read the body language well enough to understand exactly what was being planned. Tomorrow Thalvek would come back, and tomorrow he would push harder, and whatever happened next would change everything. For humanity, for the Council, and for the quiet man walking beside her, who carried the weight of his entire species on shoulders that had already carried far too much. The stars outside the station burned in silence, and the galaxy held its breath. The next morning, the Hall of Voices was packed beyond anything Lyra had ever seen before, with delegates pressed shoulder to shoulder in the upper galleries, and broadcasting drones floating through the air like silver insects, their lenses pointed down at the chamber floor where history was about to be made in the worst possible way. Word had spread overnight that Thalvek intended to make a spectacle of the human delegation. And in galactic politics, a spectacle was something nobody wanted to miss, not even the species that pretended to be above such things. Lyra walked in with her head high and her jaw set, flanked by 2 junior diplomats, and followed by Elias Harrow, who moved through the crowded corridors with the same silent ease he always carried, as though the thousands of alien eyes tracking his every step were nothing more than wind brushing past his face. She had tried to prepare him for what might come. Sitting across from him in the small human quarters on the station the night before, laying out every possible scenario she could think of. Elias had listened to all of it without interrupting, then looked at her and said 4 words, "I know what I am." She had not known what to do with that, so she simply nodded and let him go. And now here they were walking into the arena disguised as a chamber of diplomacy. The High Arbiter opened the session, and immediately Thalvek stood, requesting the floor before anyone else could speak. And the ancient insectoid adjudicator granted it with a slow tilt of her enormous head. "Before we continue the matter of human membership," Thalvek began, his golden eyes scanning the room with theatrical gravity, "I wish to invoke the right of direct address, a tradition honored by many species on this council, whereby a warrior-class representative may be called to speak for his people's honor." Murmurs swept through the chamber, and Lyra felt her stomach drop, because she knew exactly where this was going. "I call upon the human military attaché," Thalvek continued, turning to face Elias with a smile that showed every one of his sharp white teeth. "Let the war creature speak for himself, instead of hiding behind the skirts of his handlers." The High Arbiter considered the request for a long moment, then ruled it permissible under the Council's traditions of direct challenge. And Lyra bit back her objection, because fighting the ruling would only make humanity look weak. Elias stepped forward without being asked, and walked to the center of the chamber floor as if he had been expecting this all along, and perhaps he had. Thalvek circled him slowly, his tail swaying, his clawed feet clicking against the crystal floor with each step. "Tell me, human," Thalvek said, "what exactly qualifies you to stand in this chamber among species that have sailed between stars for longer than your kind has had written language?" Stood with his hands at his sides, relaxed but not loose, balanced but not tense. "I was sent here to represent Earth's military," he said, and his voice was calm and low, carrying just enough to reach the microphones without effort. "I go where I am told, and I do what is needed." "How obedient," Thalvek sneered, "like a trained animal. Tell me, do your masters reward you with food when you perform well, or is the leash reward enough?" Quiet gasps scattered across the gallery, but Elias did not react. He simply watched the Draelith with those flat gray eyes, and waited. Thalvek pressed harder, leaning in close enough that his breath washed over the human's face, hot and sharp. "Your species sends its young to kill each other in deserts and jungles over patches of dirt," Thalvek hissed. "Your warriors come home broken and destroy themselves from the inside. And you call this honor? You call this strength?" Still nothing from Elias, and the silence was becoming its own kind of weapon, because the crowd could feel it. The absence of the reaction they all expected, the rage that never came, the breaking point that refused to break. Thalvek straightened to his full 7 feet and looked down at the human with open disgust. "Your dead soldiers," he said, louder now so the whole chamber could hear. "The ones you memorialize with your little flags and your little ceremonies, they were not warriors. They were creatures too stupid to stop killing each other, too weak to evolve past their own animal instincts, and every single one of them died for nothing." A murmur of shock rolled through the chamber, because even by Draelith standards, this was a step beyond diplomatic cruelty into something deeply personal, an insult aimed not at a policy or a species, but at the graves of the fallen. Lyra, gripped the edge of the human delegation's table so hard, her knuckles turned white. Elias stood perfectly still, and his face was made of stone. But something shifted in the air around him. Not movement, not sound, just a change in pressure that every predator species in the room felt in their bones. Thalvek either did not feel it or did not care, because he leaned in one final time, his snout inches from the human's face, and spoke with quiet venom. Your kind does not belong among civilized species. You are cattle that learn to build starships, and nothing more. Then Thalvek raised his right hand, a massive scaled thing, tipped with claws that could tear through metal, and he brought it across Elias Harrow's face with all the casual authority of a master striking a disobedient servant. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent chamber. Elias's head snapped to the side from the force of the blow, and 3 thin lines of red opened on his cheek, where the claw tips had dragged through skin, and a single drop of blood fell from his jaw and hit the crystal floor with a sound that somehow carried further than the slap itself. Every delegate in the room froze, and for one terrible heartbeat, the entire Galactic Council held its breath. Then Elias moved. His head rotated back with slow mechanical precision, until his eyes found Thalvek again, and what the Draelith saw in those gray human eyes made something ancient and primal scream a warning from the distant past, deepest part of his reptilian brain. Elias was smiling. It was not a smile of amusement or politeness or submission. It was the kind of smile that had appeared on the faces of men throughout human history right before everything changed. The smile of a predator that had just been given permission to hunt. The smile of a man who had killed in darkness and silence and frozen water and burning sand, and who understood with perfect clarity that the creature standing before him had just made the worst mistake of its entire life. The gallery erupted in noise, delegates shouting, drones swooping, the High Arbiter clicking her mandibles in rapid alarm. But Elias did not move, and the smile stayed exactly where it was, and Thalvek felt something he had never felt before from a species he considered lesser. He felt fear. But nothing happened. Elias reached up with one hand and wiped the blood from his cheek, then looked at the red smear on his fingertips as if studying it with mild curiosity. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet and steady and carried to every microphone in the air. Chamber without effort. Noted. That was all he said. One word, calm and certain, and then he turned and walked back to the human delegation's table and took his place beside Ambassador Osei as if nothing had happened at all. The chamber exploded into chaos, with Lyra on her feet, filing a formal protest under 6 different treaty articles, while the Draelith delegation roared their approval and the High Arbiter struggled to restore order. But Elias Harrow just stood there with blood drying on his face and his hands clasped behind his back, watching the room with those terrible, patient eyes. In the upper galleries, 3 delegations from elder species quietly pulled their observers back from the railing, and the senior military attaché from the Velkari, an ancient warrior monk species that had studied humanity more carefully than most, turned to his aid and said something in a low voice that roughly translated to a simple warning. Very serious mistake. The Draelith delegation was celebrating as they left the chamber, with Thalvek accepting congratulations from his allies, who told him he had proven once and for all that humans were either cowards who would not fight back, or animals who could be disciplined with a firm hand. But several corridors away, in the silence of the human quarters, Ambassador Lyra Osei stood before a secure communication terminal and sent a single encrypted message to Earth, and the message contained only 2 words: he struck. Within the hour, a response came back through channels so classified that fewer than 50 people on Earth knew they existed, and the response was even shorter than her message. We know. The stars outside the station continued to burn in their ancient silence, indifferent to the small dramas of living things. But somewhere deep in the bowels of the human military machine, something cold and precise had begun to move. In the 48 hours that followed the slap, the galaxy did what the galaxy always does when something dramatic happens. It talked. The footage spread across every communication network in known space, with the speed of light and the force of a collision, and billions of beings on thousands of worlds watched a 7-foot Dralith counselor strike a human soldier across the face, and then watched that same human soldier turn his head back with blood on his cheek and smile, as if he had just been handed a gift. The reactions were divided along exactly the lines you would expect. The Dralith and their allies called it a justified cultural challenge, a dominant species putting a lesser one in its place, and they pointed to the humans' failure to strike back as proof of cowardice and biological inferiority. But the older species, the ones who had been in the galaxy long enough to know that silence was not always weakness, and that a smile could be more dangerous than a scream, those species said nothing at all, and their silence was louder than all the Dralith celebration combined. On Earth, the footage arrived through official channels, and then immediately leaked to every military installation on the planet. And the reaction among the humans who wore uniforms was not what anyone might have expected. There was no outrage, no screaming, no calls for vengeance. There was instead a cold and professional fury that settled into the bones of every soldier and sailor and operator who watched the clip, because they all recognized what Elias had done in that moment. He had not frozen, and he had not backed down. He had made a decision, and every trained warrior who watched that footage understood exactly what that decision was. He was waiting. And when a man like Elias Harrow waited, it meant that something very bad was about to happen to someone who deserved it. The file on Elias Harrow began to circulate through alien intelligence networks within hours. And as the various species read through his declassified record, the mood in several delegations shifted from amusement to unease. The man that Thalvek had slapped was not simply a soldier. He was a Tier 1 operator from the United States Naval Special Warfare Development Group, the unit that most humans knew by its older name, SEAL Team 6, and his service record read like something out of a myth. He had completed the basic underwater demolition course known as BUD-S, a training program so brutal that 80% of candidates quit before it ended. A program that included a week called Hell Week, where trainees were kept awake for 5.5 days straight, while being subjected to constant physical punishment in freezing water and mud and sand. And the instructors did not do this because they were cruel, but because they needed to find out which men would keep going when every part of their body and mind screamed at them to stop. Elias had not only completed it, he had finished first in his class. After that came years of deployments to places whose names were still classified, operations that officially never happened, commendations that took up more digital space than most species' entire military databases. The Velkari were the first to send Thalvek a warning, and they did it not out of friendship, but out of a scholarly obligation they felt toward any species about to make a catastrophic error. The data packet they sent contained a full physiological analysis of human beings, compiled over decades of careful study, and it painted a picture that most galactic species found deeply unsettling. Humans were persistence predators. They did not chase their prey in explosive bursts of speed like the Dralith, but instead followed their targets over vast distances at a steady, unrelenting pace until the prey collapsed from exhaustion. And this evolutionary strategy had burned itself into every fiber of human biology. Their bones were denser than those of most galactic species. Their pain tolerance was abnormally high. They could continue to function with injuries that would put a Dralith into shock. And when pushed to their limits, their bodies produced a chemical called adrenaline that temporarily increased their strength and speed and dulled their ability to feel pain. A compound that 3 separate galactic medical boards had formally classified as a combat narcotic. But it was not the biology that frightened the elder species, it was the training. Human Special Operations Forces did not simply learn to fight. They volunteered to be tortured, starved, frozen, drowned, and broken as part of their education. And the ones who survived this process emerged as something that did not fit neatly into any galactic category of warrior. They were patient and violent, disciplined and creative, capable of sitting motionless for days, and then unleashing devastation in seconds. And they trained for every possible scenario, including ones that most species considered impossible. Thalvek received the Velkari data packet and read it in his private quarters with his senior military advisor standing at his side. Propaganda, Thalvek said, tossing the datapad onto his desk with a dismissive flick of his clawed hand. The humans are skilled at exaggeration. It is one of the few things they do well. His military advisor, a scarred old Drelith named Counselor Voss, who had actually fought in wars instead of just talking about them, picked up the datapad and read through it again with the slow, careful attention of a man who understood that survival often depended on taking your enemy seriously. The Velkari do not exaggerate, Voss said quietly. Then they have been fooled, Thalvek replied, already moving on to his next scheme. The human did nothing when I struck him. He stood there like a frightened animal. And that is all anyone needs to know. Voss looked at his counselor for a long moment, and then, without saying another word, he returned to his own quarters and began quietly updating his personal affairs, because he had seen the footage too, and unlike Thalvek, he had noticed the one detail that mattered more than anything else. The human's hands had never shaken, not before the slap, not during, and not after. And Voss had served long enough to know that a warrior who could take a blow to the face from a superior predator, without so much as a tremor in his fingers, was not a man who had frozen in fear. He was a man who had chosen not to act yet, and the word yet was doing all the heavy lifting in that sentence. Meanwhile, in the human quarters, Ambassador Osei was engaged in a rapid exchange of encrypted messages with Earth's United Defense Command, and the conversation had moved far beyond diplomacy, into territory that made her pulse quicken. Invoke Article 7, the message from Earth read. Humanity accepts the challenge of honor. Article 7 was a clause buried deep in the galactic treaties that governed interspecies disputes, and it had been placed there centuries ago by the Drelith themselves. A provision that allowed any species that had been physically assaulted by a council member to demand satisfaction through a formal honor duel. A tradition so old that most species had forgotten it existed. But the humans had not forgotten, because humans never forgot an insult, and they certainly never forgot a rule that could be turned into a weapon. Lyra read the message 3 times, then looked at Elias, who was sitting across the room, cleaning the 3 thin cuts on his cheek, with the same detached attention a mechanic might give to a scratch on a tool. Earth wants me to invoke the right of answered honor, she said. Elias did not look up. I know, he said. If I do this, you will have to fight him, Lyra continued, in a formal arena, under Drelith combat rules, and their rules are not gentle. Elias finally looked at her, and there was something in his gray eyes that was not anger, or excitement, or fear, but was instead a kind of terrifying clarity, the look of a man who had already played out every possible version of what was coming, and had arrived at the same conclusion each time. I know, he said again. Lyra held his gaze for a long moment, then turned back to her terminal and began drafting the formal announcement. The next morning, she stood before the full galactic council and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the Hall of Voices. Under Article 7 of the Interspecies Treaty of Conduct, and in accordance with the Drelith tradition of the right of answered honor, a tradition that Counselor Thalvek Zoran himself championed as galactic law. Humanity formally demands satisfaction for the unprovoked physical assault upon our military representative. She paused and let the silence build before delivering the final line. Our champion will be Master Chief Petty Officer Elias Harrow. The chamber erupted, but through the noise and the shouting and the frantic clicking of alien mandibles, Lyra kept her eyes on Thalvek, and she watched the color drain from his scaled face, as he realized that the trap he had set for humanity had just closed around his own throat. He had wanted a spectacle. He was about to get one. The Crucible of Aethera was an arena that had existed since before humanity's ancestors had climbed down from the trees. A vast, circular pit carved from black stone at the heart of the station, where honor duels between species had been fought and settled for thousands of years. And on this day, every seat in the towering galleries was filled with beings who had traveled from across the sector to witness what was about to happen. The combat would be fought under the traditions of the aggressor's species, which meant Drelith rules, unarmed, no armor restrictions, no weapons, no surrender protocols, and the match would end only when one fighter was unable to continue or chose to yield. And in 600 years of recorded history, no Drelith had ever yielded in an honor duel. Thalvek entered the arena first, and the Drelith galleries exploded with a roar that shook the stone beneath everyone's feet. He wore ceremonial combat armor that left his arms and claws exposed, his green scales polished until they gleamed like dark emeralds, his golden eyes burning with the confidence of a predator who had been bred for exactly this kind of moment. He was 7 feet tall and over 300 pounds of dense reptilian muscle, with claws that could punch through sheet metal and a tail thick enough to shatter bone. He raised his arms to the crowd and roared, and the sound that came from his throat was something primal and vast, the kind of sound that had once echoed across battlefields on 100 worlds. Then the human entrance opened, and Elias Harrow walked out. He wore combat pants and boots and nothing else. No armor, no wraps, no ceremony, just bare skin over muscle and bone. And the 3 thin scars on his cheek from Thalvek's claws were still visible, still healing, a reminder of why they were here. He did not raise his arms to the crowd. He did not roar. He walked to the center of the arena with the easy, unhurried stride of a man walking into his own living room. And when he reached his mark, he rolled his neck once, shook out his hands, and stood still. The Drelith crowd fell into confused silence because they had expected fury or fear or at least some display of aggression, but the human just stood there with his hands at his sides, looking at Thalvek the way a mechanic looks at an engine he is about to take apart. High Arbiter Sayanovi rose in her observation platform above the arena and spoke the ancient words that began the duel. And the moment her voice faded, the fight began. Thalvek exploded forward with a speed that caught even the experienced warriors in the crowd off guard. The Drelith were sprint predators, built for devastating bursts of power, and Thalvek was among the best of them. He closed the distance in 2 strides and unleashed a combination of slashing claws and crushing blows that would have killed most beings in the galaxy within the first 3 seconds. Elias moved, not away, into the attack, slipping sideways with a precision that came from years of training against opponents who wanted to hurt him, letting the worst of the strikes whistle past his body by inches while absorbing the ones he could not fully avoid. A claw raked across his ribs and drew a line of blood. A backhand caught his shoulder and sent a jolt of pain through his arm, and the crowd gasped because the human was bleeding and the fight had barely started. Thalvek pressed his advantage with savage joy, driving Elias backward with a relentless assault, his tail sweeping low to catch the human's legs, while his claws carved the air in patterns designed to trap and destroy. He was faster than Elias. He was stronger than Elias. And in this first terrible exchange, he was winning. The Drelith galleries roared their approval, and Thalvek fed on it, pushing harder, swinging wider, pouring every ounce of his considerable power into finishing this quickly. Ambassador Osei watched from the diplomatic gallery with her hands folded in her lap and her expression completely calm. And when the junior diplomat beside her whispered nervously that the chief was in trouble, she shook her head once without taking her eyes off the arena. "Watch his feet," she said quietly. Below on the arena floor, Elias continued to give ground, bleeding from 4 separate wounds now. His breathing controlled and even, despite the punishment he was absorbing. And anyone who was not looking carefully would have thought he was simply trying to survive. But the Velkari military attaché was looking carefully. "Seat. He is not defending," the Velkari whispered to his aide, his ancient eyes tracking the human's footwork with growing recognition. "He is learning." Every step Elias took was deliberate. Every blow he absorbed was teaching him something. The reach of Thalvek's arms, the recovery time after a tail sweep, the slight drop of his right shoulder before a claw strike, the half-second pause when he shifted his weight between stances. Elias was mapping the Drelith's entire combat system in real time, filing away every pattern and every weakness with the cold, calculating focus of a man who had been trained to destroy enemies in the dark, using nothing but his hands and his mind. 3 minutes into the fight, Thalvek began to slow. It was barely noticeable at first, a fraction of a second added to each recovery, a slightly wider gap between combinations, but Elias noticed it immediately because he had been waiting for it. The Drelith were sprinters, evolved for explosive short engagements, and their physiology burned energy at a rate that could not be sustained. And Thalvek had spent the opening minutes fighting at maximum intensity against an opponent who had been doing nothing but weathering the storm. The crowd began to murmur as the shift became visible. Thalvek's strikes were still powerful, but they were coming slower, and the human was still standing, still moving, still watching, with those terrible gray eyes that never seemed to blink. Then Elias Harrow stopped retreating. It did not happen gradually. One moment he was giving ground, and the next he was moving forward. And what followed was not a brawl or a contest of strength. It was a surgical disassembly, performed by a man who had spent his entire adult life learning exactly how to take apart something dangerous. He struck Thalvek in the nerve cluster beneath his left arm with a precision that made the Drelith's entire side go numb, then followed it with an elbow to the jaw that snapped the counselor's head sideways. When Thalvek swung his tail in desperation, Elias was already inside its arc, driving his knee into the joint where the tail met the spine. And the sound Thalvek made was not a roar, but a scream. The arena fell silent. Elias moved like water, flowing around the Drelith's increasingly desperate attacks, neutralizing his claws by staying too close for them to be effective, using joint locks and leverage techniques that exploited every anatomical weakness he had spent the first 3 minutes identifying. He was not stronger than Thalvek, but he did not need to be, because strength means nothing when your opponent knows exactly where to press. Thalvek panicked, and the panic made him dangerous. He lashed out with blind fury, and his claws found Elias's torso, tearing 3 deep gashes across his chest that would have sent most beings to the ground in agony. Elias did not stop. Blood ran freely down his ribs, and his breathing was harder now, but his eyes were the same, focused, clear, absolutely without mercy. And he drove Thalvek to the ground with a takedown that used the Drelith's own momentum against him, pinning the tail beneath his knee and wrapping his arm around Thalvek's throat in a chokehold that even 7 feet of reptilian muscle could not escape. Thalvek thrashed and clawed at the human's arms, leaving bloody furrows in Elias's skin. But the hold did not weaken. It tightened with patient, relentless pressure, like the jaws of a trap that had been waiting centuries to close. The counselor's vision began to darken, and his thrashing weakened, and somewhere in the fading edges of his consciousness, he understood, with perfect, terrible clarity, that this human could kill him, not might, could, and that the only thing standing between him and death was a choice that the bleeding, broken creature on his back had not yet made. Thalvek Zorin, counselor of the Draelith Dominion, member of the Security Presidium, conqueror of lesser species, and champion of galactic military tradition, opened his mouth and spoke a word that no Draelith counselor had spoken in 600 years. "Yield," he gasped, and the word came out broken and wet. "I yield." The arena was silent. Elias held the chokehold for one more second, just long enough for Thalvek to understand that the release was a decision, not a reflex. And then he let go. Stood slowly, swaying on his feet, blood dripping from his chest and arms and ribs, onto the ancient black stone of the arena floor. And he looked down at the Draelith, gasping at his feet. Then he did something that no one in the gallery expected. He extended his hand. Thalvek stared up at it, his golden eyes wide with something that might have been shock, or confusion, or the first fragile seeds of understanding. "On Earth," Elias said, and his voice was hoarse and raw, but steady, "we do not finish a defeated enemy. We help them stand. That is what separates us from what you thought we were." The silence stretched across the arena, and up into the galleries, and out through the broadcast feeds, to every corner of known space. Then, slowly, with the last of his strength, Thalvek reached up and took the human's hand. Elias pulled him to his feet, and the two of them stood there for a moment, the bleeding human and the beaten Draelith, and the image burned itself into the collective memory of every species watching. The non-Draelith delegations rose to their feet one by one, not cheering, not shouting, just standing in silent recognition of something they had never expected to see from the species they had called primitive. Ambassador Osei remained seated with her hands still folded in her lap, and the faintest trace of a smile on her face. Because she had read Elias Harrow's file, and she had known all along exactly what kind of man Earth had sent to the stars. 1 week after the duel, the Galactic Council gathered in the Hall of Voices for the final vote on humanity's membership, and the chamber felt different in a way that was hard to name. The air was charged with something new, something that had not been there before, and every species in the room carried it differently. Some carried it as curiosity, others as caution, and a few, the ones who had built their power on the assumption that humans were lesser, carried it as fear. The footage of the duel had been analyzed by every military academy in known space, broken down frame by frame by strategists and warriors and scholars who were trying to understand exactly what they had witnessed. And the conclusions they reached were all slightly different, but they all pointed in the same direction. It was not the strength that disturbed them, because several species in the galaxy were physically stronger than humans, and it was not the speed, because the Draelith were faster. In short bursts, and it was not even the endurance, though human endurance was something that most species found frankly unreasonable. What disturbed them was the combination: the ability to absorb punishment and learn from it in real time, the patience to wait while bleeding, the discipline to fight with precision through pain that should have been paralyzing, and then, at the end of it all, the capacity to reach down and offer a hand to the enemy who had tried to destroy them. That last part was the thing that no species could quite process, because mercy from a position of absolute physical dominance was not something the galaxy saw very often, and it did not fit neatly into any of the categories they used to understand other species. Humans were not conquerors, or at least not only conquerors, and they were not pacifists, and they were not mindless brutes. They were something else entirely, something that the elder races were going to have to create a new word for. And that uncertainty was what filled the Hall of Voices on the morning of the vote. Ambassador Lyra Osei took her seat at the human delegation's table and folded her hands with the practiced calm of a woman who had spent her entire career waiting for moments exactly like this one. Beside her, Elias Harrow stood in his dress uniform with his hands clasped behind his back, and fresh bandages visible beneath his collar where the deepest of his wounds were still healing. He had refused accelerated medical treatment when it was offered by 3 separate alien species, each of which had technology that could have closed his wounds in minutes and left no trace they had ever existed. The scars should mean something, he had told the doctors, and they had not understood, but they had respected it. The High Arbiter called the session to order and began with the formal reading of the membership petition. But before the standard debate could begin, an unexpected voice requested the floor. Falvek Zorin stood from his seat in the Drelith delegation, and a gasp rolled through the chamber, because the counselor looked different. Not just physically, though the slight limp in his step and the stiffness in his movements told their own story. Deeper had changed behind his golden eyes, something that the beings who knew him best could not recall ever seeing there before. Humility. He walked to the center of the floor slowly, and the chamber fell into a silence so complete that the hum of the station's engines could be heard through the crystal walls. "I wish to address this council," Falvek said, and his voice was quieter than anyone had ever heard it, stripped of the theatrical arrogance that had defined him for 40 years of galactic politics. The High Arbiter granted permission, and every eye in the room turned to the Drelith who had started all of this, with a slap and a sneer. Falvek stood for a moment in that crushing silence, and when he spoke, his words were careful and deliberate, chosen with the kind of precision that only comes from a man who has recently learned the cost of careless ones. "I have served on this council for 40 cycles," he began, "and in that time I have spoken. Often of honor and strength and the duty of superior species to maintain order among the lesser ones. I believe these things with every scale on my body, and I believe them most of all when I looked at humans." He paused, and his golden eyes found Elias in the human delegation. "I struck a human, and called his kind primitive, and he answered with discipline that I did not expect, and could not understand. I mocked his dead, and he did not break. I challenged him before this council, and he stood in silence, while I poured every insult I could summon upon his head. And through all of it, he never once lost control." Another pause, longer this time, and the chamber held its breath. "Then I fought him in the arena, and I used every advantage my species possesses: speed, strength, claws, size, and he took everything I gave him and bled for it without flinching. And when I was spent, he took me apart with a skill and a patience that I have never encountered in any warrior of any species in my entire life." Falvek's voice dropped lower, and when I lay on the ground with his arm around my throat and my vision fading to black, I understood that I was going to die, and I was afraid, not of death, but of how wrong I had been. And I yielded, and I waited for the killing blow that any Drelith in my position would have received from any opponent in our history. Come. Instead, I saw a hand reaching down to me, covered in blood, most of it his own. And I heard a voice that was steady and calm, despite the wounds I had given him. And that voice told me that on Earth, they do not finish a defeated enemy. They help them stand. Falvek turned back to face the full council. "I have sat in this chamber for 40 cycles and spoken of honor as if I owned the word, but I did not understand it. I confused dominance with strength and cruelty with courage, and it took a human, a species I called cattle, to show me what honor actually looks like. It looks like choosing mercy when you have earned the right to destroy. It looks like bleeding for your principles instead of hiding behind your power. It looks like an outstretched hand when a closed fist would have been justified. He straightened to his full height, despite the pain it clearly caused him. I withdraw my opposition to humanity's membership, and I say to this council that if these are the kind of beings humans produce, warriors who fight with discipline and win with grace, then we do not merely owe them a seat among us. We owe them our respect. He returned to his seat, and the silence that followed was the loudest sound the Hall of Voices had ever contained. The High Arbiter allowed a moment for the weight of the words to settle, then called the vote. It was not close. Species after species cast their approval, some enthusiastically, some reluctantly, some with the quiet acknowledgement of beings who were adjusting their understanding of the galaxy in real time. And when the final count was read, the result was overwhelming. Humanity was granted full membership in the Galactic Council, with independent military patrol rights in its own sector, a permanent seat on the Security Presidium, and something that had not been offered to a new species in over 1,000 years. A formal commendation of character from the High Arbiter herself, given not for victory in battle, but for the conduct displayed in its aftermath. The human delegation accepted the honor with the quiet dignity that Lyra Osei had spent her entire career cultivating. And when the session ended and the delegates began to file out, the corridor conversations were already shifting from "should we have let them in?" to "what happens now that they are here?" The answer to that question would take years to fully reveal itself. But on that day the galaxy took its first step toward understanding that the small blue planet called Earth had produced something extraordinary. Not the strongest species, not the fastest, not the most technologically advanced, but perhaps the most dangerous in the way that truly mattered, because they were dangerous and they chose to be kind. Later that evening, after the ceremonies and the handshakes and the formal photographs that would appear in diplomatic archives for centuries, Elias Harrow stood alone on an observation deck at the edge of Aethera Prime and looked out at the stars. The station hummed beneath his boots, and the void stretched endlessly before him, filled with light from suns he would never visit and worlds he would never walk. And he stood in the silence, the way he had always stood in silence, comfortably, without need, as if the quiet was an old friend he had known longer than anyone else. Footsteps behind him, and Ambassador Osei appeared at his side with 2 cups of coffee that she had somehow procured from the human quarter's dwindling supply. She handed him one, and they stood together for a while, without speaking, watching the galaxy turn. "Can I ask you something?" Lyra said eventually. "Yes, ma'am." "In the chamber, when he slapped you, what were you thinking in that moment?" Elias was quiet for a long time, long enough that Lyra thought he might not answer at all, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low and distant, as if he were reaching back through years and oceans and dark places to find the right words. "I was thinking about my instructor at Bud S. said. First day of Hell Week, standing in the surf zone at 2 in the morning with the ocean trying to kill us. And he walked down the line and stopped in front of me and said something I never forgot. He took a sip of his coffee. He said any fool can throw a punch, but it takes a warrior to take one and choose what happens next." He looked at Lyra, and the ghost of a smile, a real one this time, warm and human and tired, crossed his face. "I chose." Lyra held his gaze for a moment, then looked back out at the stars that now belonged to humanity as much as they belonged to anyone. "Well, Chief," she said quietly, "I would say you chose well." Elias said nothing more, and he did not need to, because some things are understood better in silence than in words. And the two of them stood there together on the edge of everything, a diplomat and a warrior, a voice and a fist, both equally necessary, both equally human, and they watched the galaxy that had just opened its arms to their species. Far below in the diplomatic quarter of the station, in a small private room lit by the pale glow of a holographic display, Counselor Thalvek Zoran sat alone and stared at a frozen image on his screen. A human hand, bloody and scarred and open, reaching down toward him from above. And he wondered how he had ever looked at creatures capable of such terrible, beautiful mercy and seen anything less than equals. Stars burned on in their ancient silence, as they always had and always would. But something had changed in the space between them. A new voice had joined the chorus, steady and strong, and full of a grace that the galaxy was only just beginning to understand. Humanity had arrived, and they had arrived exactly as they were, flawed and fierce and compassionate and unbreakable, and the universe would never be quite the same again.